It's wonderful to be here. I'm here to tell you some stories. As a scientist, I find that telling stories is one of the most powerful tools a scientist can have. I was recently asked to speak in the U.S. Senate on the eve of the wolf delisting regarding the science of what wolves do to ecosystems. And I asked my mentors at OSU, how do I do this? It's a little bit intimidating for a graduate student to be asked to go to the U.S. Senate. And they said, tell stories. Don't bombard them with data and facts, tell stories. And so I did, and that was very good advice. This is my book, The Wolf's Tooth. It was published a year ago. It is based on my master's thesis and on what I've learned at Oregon State, working on my doctorate with my advisor, Bill Ripple, and many other fine scientists. In this book, my editor at Island Press, Barbara Dean, asked me to tell a story in each chapter. Now, this is a peer-reviewed book. It's a science book. It is being used as a textbook in major universities, but it is also being read by the general public, by a wide range of people. And I don't know how many printings it's gone through now. It's gone through many printings. So apparently, people are responding to these stories and to science framed within the context of these stories. I'm going to read to you an essay that I wrote when I came out of the field about 3 years ago, and I was trying to make sense of the things that I was learning about our relationship with ecosystems and the stories embedded in these ecosystems. This essay that I'm going to read to you is being published this summer in a book, as part of a book chapter I wrote in a book titled Rediscovery of the Wild for MIT Press. It's edited by Peter Kahn and Patricia Hasbach. It's an ecopsychology volume, and most of the invited contributors are people that are nature writers. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, for example. Doug Peacock, he wrote about grizzly bears. Clarissa wrote Women Who Run with the Wolves. I was the only scientist invited to contribute to this volume. And writing some of this represented a risk for me as a scientist, but I think it's something that's essential, the sort of story that be told. I'll preface this by telling you that science is rooted in empiricism, knowledge based on direct experience. My connection to my homeland, the Northern Rocky Mountains, has inspired me to use the empirical knowledge and field skills I've acquired to honor its mysteries and embrace its spirit. This combined knowledge, the primordial and the scientific, is helping me better understand the predator-prey nexus and the nature of wildness. Since moving to northwest Montana in the mid-1990s, I've been hearing wolves howl from the shoulder of our mountain. The weave of their voices invited me as a writer and scientist to consider questions beyond the pale. Scientific method entails framing hypotheses and testing them via unbiased data collection. It also means patiently looking at things very closely. And when one works in a wild landscape and looks closely at ecological relationships, one begins to experience and learn life-changing things. This essay is titled Minostaku. Chief Mountain, that's Chief Mountain, a 9,000-foot upthrust limestone slab, stands sentinel on the Rocky Mountain front in northwest Montana. Located just below the Canadian border, it marks the entry to some of the most extreme and arguably loveliest North American backcountry. Mystery and stories swirl about this glacier-sculpted peak, like the storm clouds that often shroud its flat-topped summit at dusk. Sacred to the Blackfeet, who call it Minostaku, which means the mountain of the chief, for centuries it has been used for vision quests. They say that an ancient bison skull, used by legendary chiefs as a ceremonial pillow, graces the summit. And on the equinoxes, lit by sunrise, the mountain casts a shadow shaped like the widow of the Blackfeet warrior for whom it was named. Humans have been drawn here for millennia. Warriors, shamans, gentlemen adventurers, fur trappers, outlaws, backpackers. Each has left stories imprinted on this peak and the valley at its feet. But before them, and through the present era, this mountain has also drawn wildlife, wolves, grizzly bears, lynx, and wolverines, creatures the likes of which have not been seen in most places for years. Any landscape is a palimpsest, written over through the ages by its wildlife and human inhabitants. Landscapes speak to us through these marks. My research involves reading these stories, interpreting how animal presence and human activity shapes the landscape, changing the ecology of a place, the way things grow, even the lay of the land. And indeed, I believe wild animals, particularly the wolf, a keystone species, first defined this place and continue to do so, drawn here by the sublime convergence of mountain slope, blue-gray timbered folds, riverine curves, and abundant prey that make up Chief Mountain. All mammals possess a homing instinct. They create stronger bonds with some places than others. Some places are more storied, lauded in poetry, photographed, fought over, and used as denning and hunting grounds than others. This is one of those places. For some early settlers, coming here was part of a quest. The more they traveled the west, the more tangible their craving for this place became. Journal entries suggest that some had hungered for it for so long that when they found it, it felt more familiar than the landscape of their dreams. I have seen other species home in on a place and form similar bonds. Why? And why this mountain and valley, and not the one next to it, which has similar habitat and resources? What is it about places like Minostaku that satisfy an animal's need for home? So these images are from the field. They're images that I took during the course of my research, along with some remote camera images of wolves on my project. I will tell you a story about this place. It is but one of countless, some without words, but all stories nonetheless. It is my story because I admit as a scientist this place has drawn me in and is holding me fast, holding my heart and imagination captive, and my seeking mind. It is the wolf story, the Chief Mountain Pack, as former Alberta Fish and Wildlife official Carita Bergman named them. And it is their ancestors' story, the hundreds of generations of wolves who preceded them, drawn to this landscape as ineluctably as I am. It is also a story about what scientists know, but cannot say, although that is changing. We walked single file on a narrow, overgrown whisper of a trail along the Belly River. This river flows at the feet of Chief Mountain, giving its name to the valley it carved out of limestone, a valley that crosses into Canada and is considered one of the wildest places in this landscape. Young aspen, straight and unbrowsed, grew closely along either side of the trail, the understory shrubs lush and wet from late spring rains. Our group included my field technician, Mark Thorkelson, and our guide, Rob Watt, a park conservation biologist who had worked here for 30 years and knew this place better than anyone. I had been here the previous autumn with Rob. The The place he was leading us to was a secret place, its location kept quiet to protect the wolves who denned here. Quickly, we saw evidence that we traveled in the right direction. Wolf scats deposit tellingly every 100 feet or so as territorial markers. Occasionally, we found enormous dinner plate-sized grizzly scats. Above the musical sound of river water flowing over rocks, we heard the unmistakable braid of wolfen voices. And around the next bend in the trail, something big crashed through the woods. This place was not for the faint-hearted. Hooting and hollering to let the wildlife know we were there, we cut up slope. The trail narrowed to nothing at times, but we managed to follow it. At a slender stream, we found a wolf track the size of a man's outspread hand, pressed deeply into the mud on the bank. Just past the stream, Rob led us off trail and into the forest understory. A dense thicket of snowberry, serviceberry, rose, and willow soon enfolded us. We passed beaver-cut aspen, their stumps weathered silver. After some heavy bushwhacking, we descended into the swale of a wet meadow ringed by pale green aspen and inky conifers. And there, on the edge of the meadow, we saw dark hole after dark hole dug into the sloping earth, a series of wolf dens necklacing the south-facing forest edge. Mark was new to this place. He counted the dens, 6 in all, eyes wide with wonder. I was not here to count dens, but to determine whether there was a pack at all, and if so, whether it had denned and produced pups. This pack, which Carita believed had 9 members, had lost 7 of them, all killed by ranchers between February and March of that year, when a pack typically prepares to den. And now it was June, and we were uncertain whether enough wolves remained to call it a pack, much less produce pups. We walked into the meadow and saw a partially chewed, bloody deer skull, part of the hide still attached, lying in a grassy clearing. For some reason, what we were about to walk into didn't register. We didn't think. We simply kept following a wolf trail through some willows. All at once, in a shaft of sunlight in another grassy opening, we stumbled upon 3 small, gray-colored wolf pups, playing tug-of-war with a scrap of deer hide. They became aware of us at the same moment we became aware of them, and instantly fled into the woods. We stood there too stunned to say much. We had our answer and left as quickly as possible, filled with hope. In August 2007, I returned to locate the active den, looking for a trophic cascade to see how wolf presence shapes ecosystems. The term trophic refers to anything related to the food web, while the poetic term trophic cascades refers to the movement of energy through the community food web when predators are removed or when they return. This dynamic resembles a waterfall and involves top-down regulation of an ecosystem in which predators have a controlling influence on prey abundance and behavior at the next lower level, and so forth through the food web. Remove a top predator, such as the wolf, and deer and elk grow more abundant and bold, damaging their habitat by consuming vegetation called herbivory in an excessive and unsustainable manner. Intensive herbivory can lead to elk literally eating themselves out of house and home, and consequently to loss of biodiversity and destabilization of ecosystems. Return wolves to ecosystems, and elk become more wary, staying on the move, consuming vegetation with more restraint. That is an elk from my project, and it is hyper vigilant in an area that wolves were using frequently in the same area that I'm writing about in the Belly River. These evolutionary behavioral relationships between predators and their prey are part of what ecologist Joel Brown termed the ecology of fear. But trophic cascades, like everything in ecology, are complex. They're also influenced by plant growth and the sun's energy and powerful disturbances such as fire, which move nutrients through ecosystems from the bottom up and cause things to grow rapidly. I visited the Belly River Den site to test the hypothesis that areas of most intense wolf use, such as dens, would show the strongest trophic cascades. The ecological marks of having this species in a landscape. We bushwhacked into the meadow, clambering over deadfall, unwittingly flushing a chittering flock of winter wrens. We walked along the meadow edge, examining the dens until we found the one most recently used. Set into the root ball of a Douglas fir, the den was massive and complex, the largest and most finely crafted I'd ever seen, with 4 openings, each one smooth, deep, and clean, the bare earth finely tattooed with layers of wolf tracks. Clumps of shed wolf hair festooned the wild roses that bracketed the entrance, and pup chew toys, elk jawbones, a beaver skull, and a purloined human shoe lay strewn about nearby. The Chief Mountain Pack had denned here for many years. Some days when I worked at this site, I could feel in my bones that this was its ancestral denning ground and had been the pack's home far longer than we realized. For no matter how often humans shot or poisoned them, these wolves kept returning, their big hearts and big feet leading them along their ancestors' trails, which arrowed toward the dens. More stories on this landscape, perhaps best told as a chronology. In 1805, Meriwether Lewis, co-leader of the Lewis and Clark expedition, saw Minostaku and renamed it Tower Mountain. In the 1880s, humans settled the lowlands in this area, bringing with them cattle. Many were fundamentalist Mormons who held a fervent aversion to wildness and to any creatures who represented that wildness, particularly wolves. They cleared the land for ranching and farming and built tidy communities on the prairie, creating with their labor a testimony to God and order amid the chaos of the wild. Paradoxically, they restored the name Minostaku to better reflect Blackfeet heritage, calling it in English Chief Mountain. In 1911, part of this landscape, including Chief Mountain, was taken from the Blackfeet Indians and set aside to form 2 national parks, Glacier National Park in the United States and Waterton Lakes National Park in Canada. George Bird Grinnell led the charge for the glacier part and has one of the park's glaciers named after him. In 1912, fur trapper Joe Cosley became the first Belly River backcountry ranger. His station lay at the foot of Chief Mountain. He reported abundant wolves, grizzlies, and game, and served here for 2 years until he was charged with poaching. By 1916, all the wolves in this area had been killed, some with poison, some with snares, others with bullets, all with the best of intentions, for conventional wisdom of that era held that the only good non-human predator was a dead one. In the 1940s, wolves drifted down from the north and returned to Chief Mountain. Ranchers killed any they saw, although by then wolves had gained protection within the U.S. national parks. In the 1970s, wolves returned again to this area and were killed again. In 1994, Rob Watt collaborated with University of Montana researchers Bob Bream and Elliot Fox to radio collar the wolves in the Chief Mountain Pack. All 4 collared wolves were shot by ranchers within 4 months. Things would not improve over the years. In February 2007, as part of my research, we radio collared one of the Chief Mountain wolves, a yearling male. He wore an Argos satellite collar, which gave me data every 2 hours. Please don't be a bonehead, I would admonish him every time I received data on my computer. A red dot vividly marking each location, the dots strung together in a way that indicated he was moving perilously close to ranch lands. On the 10th day after he was collared, a rancher shot him dead. The wolf hadn't been doing anything bad, hadn't eaten calves or harassed livestock like some wolves do. But in Alberta, ranchers are legally entitled to shoot wolves within 5 kilometers of their land for any reason. Between February and March 2007, ranchers shot 6 more wolves in the Chief Mountain Pack. In June 2007, we miraculously stumbled upon this pack's pups. In July 2007, a rancher began telling the story about how he trapped and shot another wolf in this pack, an adult female. He'd been able to express milk from the dead she-wolf's nipples, so he claimed to have killed the alpha female. When I heard this story, I thought about the pups playing in the sunlight and wondered whether they had been old enough at the time of their mother's death to survive. Maybe. Another rancher began telling a story about a marauding flock of 30 wolves running through his land. Some who knew better shook their heads and laughed at the absurdity of this tale. Others believed it and allowed it to inflame the anti-wolf sentiment that had smoldered deeply in the ranching community for years. In August 2007, when I returned to the Chief Mountain Pack's den, the aspen leaves shimmered gold. I was heartened to find pup scats all over the place, hundreds of them. And one day, as I worked with my field crew to measure the vegetation composition and aspen dynamics around the den, I encountered a black wolf pup moving in my direction, a different pup than the ones we'd been seeing before. When it saw me, it turned and vanished like smoke into the forest understory. Also in August, at Rob's request, I took artist-scholar Trudy Smith to the Chief Mountain Den. She was doing a repeat photography project in the park, writing her dissertation in art and anthropology on how some places and their stories exert a stronger pull on humans and wildlife. This was one of those places. We sat at the active den and talked about place and naming and story, about which came first, the attraction to a place or its name and story, or whether they were inextricably interwoven like the wolf trails that we had followed into the den. So that's the meadow that leads into the den. The dens were found quite by accident by a park warden who was hiking with her dog, and her dog took off, and she went after her dog into this wetland, and there were all these dens in a place that nobody had known they existed. It's very tangled in there. And then I found more compelling evidence of the pull of this place. Winter comes early to this landscape. By September, snowfall mantled Chief Mountain, cutting short my vegetation sampling. Rob took me and my daughter Bianca, who is Cherokee Indian, by the way, on an exploratory mission about a half-mile up the mountain shoulder from the meadow dens. It was a glorious day of field, the air crisp, the aspen at the peak of their turning, blazing like souls on fire against the dark conifers. The snow melted a bit as we climbed past musky bull elk wallows and over the thick deadfall of an old burn to where Rob had located the Chief Mountain Pack's den back in spring of '94. He had been alone then, traveling on skis until the slope had become too great and he had to remove them. He sat on a rock and used telemetry to locate the wolves. They had been quite close, their signals coming from every direction, so he turned off the receiver and simply began to follow tracks. Soon, at the base of a conifer, he ran into an adult wolf who took off. A few steps later, he found the den, the pups inside, a ball of black fur curled together for warmth. Now it was 17 years later, and Rob was attempting to find the den again. It didn't take him long. It was set into some jackstraw from the burn and looked to have been unused for several years. Some of its walls had collapsed and wild roses had overgrown its main opening. Bianca wandered around and soon found another old den dug into the root ball of a downed conifer. It also showed no evidence of recent use. We ate lunch and pondered this pack's connection to this place and why they might have switched from the upper dens to the downslope ones. Starting back down, we spoke about returning to the upper dens the following year to survey the vegetation. And then I came upon another den, its dark mouth gaping in the understory of some old-growth Douglas firs, and yet another den not far from it, and another still, and then we had to sit down. The sheer number of dens in this area was overwhelming. Together with the downslope dens, which were connected to the upslope dens by a network of wolf trails, they formed a huge complex which had undoubtedly been used by wolves for many years. We talked about what this might mean, this place's history, ancestry, and ecological importance. And we surmised about what we might find, how many more dens, if we really looked. At the end of my field season that year, I tried to make sense of all this. What is it about Chief Mountain that continues to draw wolves and humans as it has for ages and as it has drawn me? What can we learn here about place and relationships and conservation? The events that had occurred here, wolf predation, First Peoples spiritual quests, European settlement, and trophic cascades had acted upon it and created stories. Some were part of a rich oral tradition, while others were like the weave of wolves' voices that rises and falls at dawn and dusk, something wordless we can relate to on a visceral level but can't fully comprehend. The wolves that belong by nature to this landscape, their stories run as long as the Belly River, as deep as our human quest for truth, and form part of a collective congenital memory of this place. These wolves' fate has hung in the balance each year that I've studied them, due to our incomplete human acceptance of wildness and our poor understanding of how to live with it as we continue human enterprises such as ranching. That there are wolves here at all is because of the delicate rapprochement we have achieved with this species in the decades since we drove it to the brink of extinction. It demonstrates enough reverence for life in some quarters to concede to these wolves the right to exist. Wolves are proxies for wildness. The answers we are struggling to gain about what wildness means and why we need it lie at the heart of ecological processes such as trophic cascades and the ecology of fear. Trophic cascades are also intrinsic to our ability to live rightly and prosper as a species. The Chief Mountain Pack's story, the devastating vicissitudes of their lives, symbolize our existential struggle to come to terms with our relationship with the earth and mend our tattered web of life before it falls to pieces. While these wolves have taught me astonishing lessons about courage, resilience, and hope, they have also taught me that we still have far to go. In the meantime, the wolves keep teaching us, communicating about their powerful effects on ecosystems in ways that are sometimes brazen to the point of being humorous. Always after such lessons, I'm left reflecting on what scientists know but cannot say, that our relationships with animals are reciprocal, regardless of how empirically we try to look at them. They are not just study units. They are living beings that touch all members of the web of life with their presence, including the researchers who study them. My story is not unique. Many ecologists studying relationships between species and whole ecosystems have similar stories to tell. These stories need telling, especially because they embody what scientists know but can't always say. In science, we are taught to be cautious, to couch all our communications about our work in precise, formal, scientific language. a language steeped in tradition, that only this form of communication will carry credibility in science and policy circles. But my research is teaching me that the stories written on the landscape, sometimes best told using tawny grammar, are the ones that most need telling. I returned to Chief Mountain the following year, and the next, and the next, and the next, to parse out these stories and what they could teach me about sustainability of whole ecosystems and of the human spirit. Thank you.